Hello, this is Mark Shipp, and this is the final installment in the Genesis 1 through 11 Brentwood Oaks Wednesday night adult class series. We're going to be covering chapter 9, verse 18 through the end of chapter 11. It's a lot of different information, especially covering Noah and his family leaving the ark, the drunkenness of Noah after planting a vineyard, the curse of Canaan, the Table of Nations in chapter 10, the Tower of Babel story, and the genealogy of Shem. Let me share the screen now. So beginning in verse 18 of chapter 9 on, Noah and his family leave the ark. This is after the sacrifice that Noah made to ratify the covenant earlier in chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9. This is verses 18 and 19. The sons of Noah who went out from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. That will become important in a little bit. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these was scattered the population of all the earth. This is one of three words for scatter used in Genesis for scattering, filling the earth, being replenishing the earth, multiplying, and in compliance with the command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so they complied with that command. The first thing we're told after Noah and his family leave the ark is that Noah plants a vineyard, so he becomes the first vintner. And no sooner does he plant the vineyard, but he becomes drunk. And so after becoming drunk and naked in his tent, his son Ham ogles him. Near as we can figure, his son stares at him. I don't believe this has anything to do with homosexual activity in this context, but it's simply inappropriate, completely inappropriate behavior to dishonor the father. Shem and Japheth, when they find out what's happened, they avert their eyes so they don't look on their father's nakedness, and they cover their father up by walking backwards to put a covering over him. When Noah awakened, he lays a curse, interestingly enough, not on Ham, but on his son, on Ham's son, Canaan. Now, there's been a lot of speculation over many hundreds of years over what exactly this means. It has been justification for enslavement of Black people. It's been used to justify lots of things, but I think that is all not correct. It, I think, is the origin story for why the Canaanites were a cursed population and subject to Israel's later devotion to their destruction. And perhaps also it's a foreshadowing of why it was that the Canaanites, during the period of the conquest and the judges, become hewers of wood and drawers of water for the Israelites. And this is a classical painting by Michelangelo about Noah's drunkenness. Verses 28 and 29, the end of chapter 9, gives the lifespan of Noah, extremely long life, and his death. This is typical lifespans before the flood, very, very long, and lifespans become much shorter, increasingly shorter after the flood. Now, whatever we don't know about this, which is voluminous, this parallels an ancient writing called the Sumerian King List, or a list of kings and their and brief accomplishments that they accomplished before and after the Great Flood. This was produced at the very beginning of the second millennium BC, so around 2000 BC, maybe slightly before that. The kings of Sumer, that is southern Babylon, before the flood have tremendously long lives, hundreds or thousands of years long. After the flood, their lifespans are much shorter. So whatever we don't know and can't say for positive about such lifespans, we do have a document that parallels the biblical account in this respect. Now, the Table of Nations in chapter 10, I'm going to be going over this as quickly as possible. It is simply a list of roughly 70 nations. And so we call it the Table of Nations. These are the children of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Now, one of the things to pay attention to is that all of these descendants are in fact nations. And the nations are, for the most part, identifiable by us. Some are difficult, but and some unknown. But for the most part, they are places we can put on a map and we can say something about them. Also, the names of these nations have been updated for readers in the first millennium BC. So when the biblical text was written down, these names are names that people in the first millennium BC, in 1000, let's say BC, would know, would understand what was being referred to. So the blue rectangles here represent the sons of Japheth, the red, the sons of Ham, and the green, the sons of Shem. I've not been able to fit everything on this satellite map. Many of them, and you'll see at the bottom, there's a rather large rectangle with a red arrow pointing south. That is middle and southern Arabia and Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan. That whole area does not show up on this map, so you'll have to use your imagination with some of them. Otherwise, I've been able to get everything on here. One of the important things to recall is that the whole world, from the standpoint of this writing, is here. This is the whole world they knew anything about. And so Noah's sons peopled the entire earth, the cosmos that they were aware of. Anything beyond these borders was unknown to them at that particular time of their history. So the Table of Nations, let me say a word about genealogies and why we have them. I think they're much more important than people often give them credit. My brother has spent a great deal of time on Ancestry.com trying to track the genealogy of my own family, the Shipp family, and we were able to establish that back to around 15 or 1600 in Sheffield, England. And so, the reason to do this is, I think there are three reasons that I give here, at least three reasons. One, to establish identity. That is, what is the Shipp family? Where do they come from? So it establishes who I am as a product of my past history. Now, one extremely important aspect of this establishing identity is the genealogies and chronicles say, establish that the post-exilic Jews, that is in chapter 9 of First Chronicles, are the same people as the pre-exilic Israelites. They are not somehow different. There's an unbroken chain of genealogy connecting them. The second thing genealogies do is establish legitimacy. An example of this is priests in the book of Ezra must demonstrate that they are of the tribe of Levi, and how they did that was by checking the genealogies. so that they can, in fact, function as priests in the post-exilic age after the Jews have returned from exile to Babylon. Also, genealogies can track a particular history. They can show the history of a particular line. For example, the genealogy of Esau in Genesis tracks the movement and development of Esau's line down to the foundation of the nation of Edom that Esau is the founder of. Now, there are two types of genealogies, and we have seen, now that we're in chapter 10, we've seen both of these in Genesis. One is called linear. That is, a particular person begot another person who begot so-and-so, who begot so-and-so, who begot so-and-so. That is one line of descent from father to son, to son, to son, to son. And so on down the line through one particular line. That we see in Genesis 4 and 5. And also in chapter 11 with the genealogy of Shem. A segmented genealogy bears resemblance to a family tree. That is, one particular family tree with all the branches of the extended family, the children of particular children going out on the limbs of a tree. So it shows several lines of descent, and the Table of Nations is segmented. It is like that, a family tree. A few more important things about genealogies. While the Table of Nations might reflect individuals' names, it clearly chronicles the development of nations. So these may well go back to individual people, but its importance is that it chronicles how nations developed. All the names in the list are nations and tribes of the ancient world. Secondly, the division into three parts of the world from the three sons of Noah has been difficult to understand throughout the centuries. They may reflect different language groups, but it's not entirely consistent. For example, Japheth equals pretty clearly Indo-European languages. But there are some Indo-European groups, such as the Hittites and the Hivites, that spoke Indo-European languages that show up in the line of Shem. I think it does reflect geographical distribution, that the Japhethites were in the area of Turkey and the northern Euphrates, southern Russia, Iran. The sons of Ham, North Africa, and the Levant, that is the coastline of the Eastern Mediterranean region that we would know as Israel and Syria and Lebanon. So early Canaanite peoples. And the sons of Shem, Semitic peoples of Syria, Mesopotamia, Arabia, Yemen, Ethiopia, etc. I did mention, though, there is some overlap linguistically and geographically. So no one system seems to capture the complexity of what's going on here. So very quickly, the sons of Japheth, all of these blue ones. Let me just go over this map. I've got another slide that details this in more detail, but I'm going to hit just the high points here. Tiras may well be the Thracians of Asia Minor, or else perhaps they are the inhabitants of Troas or Troy. Javan clearly is the Ionian Greeks, or the Greeks of Western Turkey. The Dodanim equal the Rodanim, that is the people of Rhodes, from the island of, the large island of Rhodes in the Mediterranean. Magog, we're not certain about, and Magog may be a word that means something like the land of Gog, and that is perhaps Gyges, the king of Lydia. And so many commentators would suggest that Magog is Lydia of the central northern area of Asia Minor, or Turkey. Tubal is known as Tubalu in Assyrian writings, and so we sort of know where that is. Tarshish is, I believe, Tarsus of Saul, and I believe, my opinion is, it has nothing to do with Tartessus in Spain that you'll often hear about, but I think it's the southern coastline, the southeastern coastline of Turkey. The Kittim and Elisha. Elisha is likely the ancient name for Cyprus, which is Alashia. And so I think these may well be the land of Cyprus, the island of Cyprus. Togarma is a city in a region in the northern Euphrates. Rifat is unclear, but up by the Black Sea. Meshech is ancient Mushku of Assyrian writings that was a thorn in the flesh later on of the Assyrian Empire. So I go into that in more details here on this slide. A couple of ones that didn't make it on that map because it cut them off was Gomer and Ashkenaz, also sons of Japheth, the ancient Cimmerians and the Scythians of southern Russia. They were horse nomads of the southern Russian steppe. And Madai equals the Medes that later become the Medo-Persian Empire of Western and Northern Iran. And so the Medes of Northwestern Iran. The sons of Ham are all of the ones that are red here. This is a little more difficult because of the geographical spread and also many questions we have about it. Put is clearly Libya. The Luddites are probably the Lubian or Lubite people of Libya. Also the Anamites and Lahavites probably in northern or central Libya. Mitzrayim is clearly Egypt. Pathros was a region also of Egypt. The Jebusites, Girgashites, Amorites, Sidon, Canaan, all of these are tribes of peoples in the region of northern and southern Canaan, or what we would call Lebanon and Israel today. Dedan is a group in northwestern Arabia. The Arkites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, Hamathites, those are all northern Canaan dwelling people in the far north. A couple of interesting issues. The Hittites and Hivites were Indo-European peoples. They spoke Indo-European languages. So the Hittites' homeland was actually in Turkey. The Hivites from the northern Euphrates region, but they had some that lived further south. And so it's unclear what function they serve here in among the sons of Ham, which would be Canaanites, for the most part, Canaanites and North Africans. And so I go over that here as well. The sons of Shem would be these in green. That is mainly peoples of Syria and the northern desert of Arabia, and Assyria and Babylon and the Elamites. Also, Almodad, Hazarmavet, and et cetera, including Sheba. Most of these we do know, not all, but most of these we do know where they are. They're in the region of Yemen, so off of this map, way far south, southern Arabia. Hazarmavet would be the extremely dry desert of southern Arabia that we would know as Hadramaut. Sheba, of course, is in Yemen and also across the Red Sea in Ethiopia or Eritrea. Ophir, also the coastline of Western Arabia that we know of from other places in Genesis and elsewhere in Scripture as producing very fine gold. Also, the Arameans, Aramaic people, speaking peoples of Syria, and Uts, desert-dwelling nomads of northern Arabia, that show up in Job and in some other passages in Genesis and elsewhere in Scripture. Now, what is the point of all of that? There are, I mentioned, roughly 70. I think if you don't count nations twice, you have exactly 70 nations. That is a theological number for all the nations that they knew anything about. These are the full complement, the full congregation of all the nations, if you will, the gathering of all the nations, and from the three sons of Noah that filled the earth. Now, when we get to chapter 11, we have a problem because we already have the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth sort of filling the earth. But in Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel story, all the people of the earth, all the descendants of Noah, were all in one place in the southern Babylonian plain, that is Shinar, northwest of the Persian Gulf. That they gathered in one place, they spoke one language, had one tongue. And so I think this is backtracking. When the family of Noah left the ark, then we have the Table of Nations, which is, this is the accounting of all the descendants of Noah. And then we backtrack to their immediate descendants gathering in one place. Now, in that one place, they decide to build a tower and a city, and they're all gathered into a single region of southern Iraq. What exactly is the sin of the people at this time that causes God to destroy the tower and the city and disperse them and confuse their languages? So what exactly is the sin? Well, it could be two or three things. From the context and also from the story itself, we're told they were gathered in one place, and they went together and determined to build a city and a tower and make a name for themselves, we're told, lest they be scattered over the face of the earth, in violation of the repeated commands to multiply and fill the earth and scatter in it. And so the ironic result is, once God sees what they're up to, then he scatters them regardless. And so they end up fulfilling unwillingly the command to replenish and scatter and fill the earth. Another possible reason for the sin of the Tower of Babel story is hubris, that is, arrogance or extreme pride. They had resolved to make a name for themselves lest they be scattered. Though, interestingly, God is the one prior to this who does the naming. God is the supreme namer in Genesis. Name can also mean reputation or fame. They wanted to generate their own reputation, name, fame. Also, as a part of this, they wanted to make a tower to reach the heavens. So extreme hubris or pride. Isaiah 14 is the fall of Daystar, son of Dawn, who tried to rise up to the heavens and replace God in heaven. And so it may be something like that. Perhaps that's a third notion of what the sin of the Tower of Babel story is. Now, along the way, there are other issues that arise, and that is one function of this story is that it's the origin story for the city of Babylon and the region of Babylon. Why is it called Bavel in Scripture? Well, Bavel means the gate of the gods or the gate of God. And In fact, it is a play on words in the Hebrew, where it's called Babylon or Bavel because God balalt. He confused the languages. So instead of the gate of God, it is confusion that results. So this is an etymology for the city in the region of Babylon. The second thing that it may be is the origin, or that it certainly is, the origin of human languages. Why are there so many human languages? Well, because of the sin of the Tower of Babel and God's confusion of the languages, which is interestingly overcome in Acts chapter 2. Part of what Jesus the Christ does, and through the endowment of the Holy Spirit in Acts 2 on the early disciples, was to overcome the confusion of languages, the curse, so to speak, at the Tower of Babel, by the disciples all speaking to people through the Spirit in their own native tongues. I think before we move on to the end of this, there are a couple of major theological themes that I think are well worth paying attention to. I think that we have a couple of series here. One is a series of alienations, and the other is a series of redemptive acts with God's providential care, going simultaneously with those alienations. For example, in chapter 3, the sin in the garden with resulting alienation from the presence of God and scattering, being forced out of the garden to go into the world and replenish it. Secondly, in chapter 4, Cain's murder of Abel, with him being alienated from God and from his own family, and resulting wandering through the earth, or a scattering, if you will. The third is the extremely strange story of the sons of God and the daughters of men in the beginning verses of chapter 6. Where the sons of God come down, and I think it has to do with divine beings having relations with human women, with the resulting alienation, that is, since human sin has even threatens the realm of the divine realm, there is alienation, that is the flood, punishment, if you will, and then scattering after the flood. And then the Tower of Babel, which we've just gone over, with alienation and scattering over the face of the globe. Simultaneously, we have a series of redemptive acts with God's providential care in spite of sin. And in fact, there is no act of judgment that doesn't have concomitantly also an act of God's providential care. For example, God makes clothing for Adam and Eve after the sin in the garden. Secondly, God provides a mark on Cain after his murder of Abel in order to preserve Cain's life. Thirdly, the ark of Noah is built, and the family of Noah is preserved in it along with animals through the flood to preserve life. And finally, the election of Abraham from the line of Shem after the alienation and scattering of the Tower of Babel story. This is rebuilt. It was the ruins of the great ziggurat, or temple tower of Ur, probably known, this is likely the famous temple of Sagila in Ur of southern Babylon. So the Tower of Babel might well have been one such ziggurat or temple tower from this same region. And this is Peter Bruegel's artistic representation of the building of the Tower of Babel. Very quickly, Genesis 11, 10 through 26, the genealogy of Shem. This is the fifth of the Toledot books, or books of generations. So fifth in the line. There are 10 of them in Genesis. This is number 5. We return to the linear genealogy of one single line of descent that we had in chapters 4 and 5. A couple of interesting things, and we're not going to be going over these in any detail at all. The absolute symmetry of the presentation, 10 generations from Adam to Noah, 10 generations from Noah's son Shem to Abram. So we went from Noah to the genealogical table of nations of his 3 sons in chapter 10 to the focus on one line, that of Shem, here in chapter 11. The point of all this recounting, according to many scholars, is to get us as quickly as possible to the story of Abram and Sarai, or Abraham and Sarah, where God's redemption of creation will take an important new turn with God's promises to Abram in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. Finally, Genesis 11, 27 through 32, the 6th Toledot book of Genesis, or book of generations in Genesis. And that is the book of the generations of Terah, the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And in very brief, very, very summary fashion, Terah is their father. Haran, who we're told is the father of Lot, who is important later on in the text, dies in Ur of Chaldea. Terah, Nahor, Abram, and then Haran's son Lot journey to a place called Haran, which is a famous city, that is Abraham's city, today located in southeastern Turkey. Now, a question here, is this the famous Ur of Chaldea in southern Babylon or southern Iraq today? Is that what is intended, or is it another Ur of the northern Euphrates region, not nearly as far from the city of Haran on the northern Euphrates? Well, we don't really know the answer to that, except to say that Chaldeans were in fact not originally Babylonians, but Aramaic-speaking peoples. Chaldeans equal Arameans, that is, northwestern Syrians, for what we call today Syria. And so perhaps it makes more sense to think of Ur of Chaldea as another Ur of the original Chaldean homeland. Only much later are the Chaldeans associated with the Babylonians, only in the 1st millennium BC. Nahor's wife, we're told, is Milcah, and she shows up also later in Genesis as an important figure. Abram's wife is Sarai. Finally, the most important point of this is that Sarai was barren, and in fact, all matriarchs in Genesis, that is Abram's wife, Isaac's wife, and Jacob's wife, all 3 are in fact barren. And God does wonders and miracles in providing children for them. And I think this sets up the plot for the unfolding of God's providence and his promises and covenant through Abraham and Sarah. Thank you very much for your attention. And I will turn this over to whoever is going to be taking the class following this. So my tour of duty here in Genesis 1 through 11 is complete. Thank you all very much for your attention.